Hi everyone, Paul Bertorelli for AVweb. Just as I was editing the video you're about to see, I got an email from a Boeing 767 pilot friend of mine who related a story very similar to the one we're about to cover here. He was the PNF, that's the pilot not flying or pilot monitoring, and while flying an approach into a major international airport, he heard swearing from the first officer, followed by an attention-getting pitch excursion. He looked down for 5 seconds to make a frequency change when the airplane's automation suddenly did exactly what someone told it to do, but which was nonetheless not desired. By the time he re-entered the loop, the FO had tweaked the desired selector and tamped things down. My friend said it took about 20 seconds to figure things out, and by then it was all over. And that sort of thing probably happens, a dozen times a day, or at least it did before COVID-19 dried up airline flying. The point is, automation in airplanes is great stuff, but with Homo the Sap still in the loop, it can cause machine-assisted chaos. The accident we'll review here is not an automation accident. It's a lack of piloting skill accident, aggravated by misused automation. This week, the NTSB held a sunshine hearing on its investigation into the crash of Alice Air 3591 on a flight from Miami to Houston on February 23, 2019. 3 crew members aboard that airplane were killed. Alice Air is a cargo airline, and it's a contract hauler for Amazon. The flight was carrying freight into Houston's Bush Airport. To cut right to the chase, the summary is this. The airplane crashed into Trinity Bay, 40 miles southeast of Houston, while skirting the edge of convective weather and some turbulence. It crashed into the shallow bay after entering a 46-degree nose-down dive that accelerated from 225 knots to 433 knots in 30 seconds, reaching a maximum vertical speed of 30,000 feet per minute. Here's how the NTSB reconstructed it.
We will show a short animation depicting the sequence of events. Note that the depictions are not necessarily identical to the airplane displays. In this still frame, you can see a simulated external view of the airplane, the analog airspeed indicator with digits to aid clarity, the main attitude director indicator, including an airspeed tape display and artificial horizon, and here is a representation of the flight mode annunciator display. An analog altimeter, also with digits added for clarity, the control yoke position, thrust levers, the speed brake lever position, a profile graph, and select cockpit voice recorder transcript items. This animation may be disturbing to some viewers who may wish to blank the screen for about 90 seconds. The crew was setting up the approach procedure when the airplane encountered light turbulence. Shortly afterward, the autopilot and auto throttles entered go-around mode as the airplane was passing about 6,300 feet. There were no flight crew callouts. Consistent with the activation of the go-around mode, the airplane arrested descent and began a slight pitch-up. The thrust levers advanced, and the speed brakes were retracted, which could only be done manually. The captain responded to a routine radio call, while the first officer pushed forward on the column and made an expression about speed and exclaimed, "We're stalling." There was no indication that the airplane actually stalled. It was likely that the first officer was experiencing disorientation due to the somatogravic illusion, in which airplane acceleration results in a false nose-high feeling. The airplane reached a steep nose-down attitude and high speed. Below about 3,000 feet, the airplane broke out of the clouds. The controls moved to full nose up, but it was too late before they impacted the bay.
The NTSB was unsparing in its analysis and concluded that the first officer inadvertently activated the airplane's go-around mode and then, due to spatial disorientation, misinterpreted the airplane's attitude as nearing a stall, and he sharply commanded nose down. Captain was slow to respond, and by the time he did counter the first officer's pitch down, it was too late to recover the airplane. The aircraft was never near a stall condition. Much of the hearing was given over to discussion of the first officer's weak piloting skills and how he was able to conceal an unfavorable employment record from Atlas when he was hired. More on that later. But first, a clarification of terms. Transport aircraft equipped with autopilots, that's basically all of them, have what's called a go-around mode. Even light aircraft autopilots sometimes have this capability. In the 767, the switch for go-around mode is on the throttles, and when commanded, the airplane smoothly pitches up about 4 or 5 degrees, and the auto throttles advance to produce a 2,000 foot per minute climb. It is not an abrupt maneuver. The NTSB believes the first officer accidentally bumped the go-around button because he likely had his hand on the speed brake control, which is located on the captain's side of the cockpit pedestal. It requires an awkward reach, and due to light turbulence, the first officer's hand may have bumped the button. At least that's the theory. A veteran 767 training captain I know told me he doesn't see how this could happen and never saw it in decades of instructing. But however it happened, it's pretty clear that it did happen. Although the go-around maneuver is not aggressive, the acceleration may have been enough to induce a kind of spatial disorientation called somatogravic illusion. You probably remember this from your instrument training and maybe even basic flight training. Human sense of balance is controlled by the inner ear's vestibular system. 3 semicircular canals sense accelerations in pitch, yaw, and roll. Within the vestibular labyrinth are 2 structures referred to as otolith organs. These sense movements in the vertical and horizontal planes, such as side-to-side or front-to-back head movement. When an airplane pitches up in visual conditions, the pilot properly senses this. Similarly, if the otolith organ is subject to level acceleration, outside visual reference will confirm there's no pitch up. But in instrument conditions, the brain may interpret level acceleration as a pitch up moment, possibly a rapid one. This is somatogravic illusion, and it may have led the first officer to believe mistakenly that the aircraft was approaching stall angle of attack. Here's how the NTSB's David Lawrence described it.
Because the first officer was not effectively scanning his instruments, interpreting the information they provided, he experienced sensations which led him to incorrectly conclude that the airplane was stalling. While the airplane was not in a stall condition, the first officer's aggressive nose-down inputs and his failure to disconnect the autopilot and auto thrust were contrary to his training and Atlas Air SOPs for both a stall recovery or an unintended automation change. The first officer should have disconnected the automation and manually returned the airplane to its original profile. Instead, the first officer continued to make manual inputs that overrode the autopilot and forced the airplane into a steep dive that was unrecoverable. The first officer's apparent struggles with impulsive action during training scenarios at multiple employers suggest that he had an inability to remain calm during stressful situations.
This trace from the airplane's flight data recorder shows how aggressively the first officer reacted. This blue line depicts pitch, green line is airspeed, and the purple line is altitude. Time is along the bottom scale. From the initiation of the inadvertent go-around here, where the pitch up starts, to impact was about 37 seconds. Go-around power was reduced, but not significantly. Pitch recovery starts 22 seconds after the go-around command, when the captain began reversing the first officer's nose-down input. But it was too late. The aircraft impacted pitch down at about 16 degrees and at 433 knots. The 767 has, by the way, what's called a split-path elevator, meaning the left and right elevators work independently of each other. But the pitch-up command has slightly less authority than the pitch-down command. Not that it would have mattered much because of the captain's delayed response. And the NTSB found that the captain's response was a factor in the accident cause. From the hearing, again, here's David Lawrence.
During the descent, as the captain was acting as pilot monitoring and setting up the approach and communicating with air traffic control, his attention was diverted from monitoring the airplane's state and verifying that the airplane was proceeding as planned. This delayed his recognition of and response to the first officer's unexpected actions to place the airplane in a dive. As pilot in command, the captain is directly responsible for and is the final authority on the operation of that aircraft. Despite having demonstrated an effective transfer of control several minutes earlier when the first officer had his display problem, the captain failed to assume positive control away from the first officer and arrest the airplane's descent, and instead began making manual control inputs simultaneously with the first officer that overrode the autopilot all the way to impact.
As you heard, the NTSB was critical of the captain's failure to use proper transfer of control. Pilots are trained to verbalize handoff of aircraft control by some version of the phrase, "I have control," or "you have control." In this case, the captain failed to do that and simply input nose up commands without informing the first officer that he was assuming control. However, just a few minutes earlier, the first officer had a minor problem with his display, and the two pilots did exchange control with the proper verbal notification while the first officer corrected the problem. Also worth noting is that during the descent, 40 miles from the airport, the first officer called for flaps 1. That extends leading edge slats, but not trailing flaps. This is counter to Atlas procedures, and I'm told that it's unusual to select flaps 1 that far from the airport. Furthermore, flaps 1 enables the go-around mode to be selected. With flaps retracted, go-around mode is inhibited. At the hearing, NTSB Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg asked how long the captain had to intervene after the pitch down and recover the aircraft.
Do we have any estimate as to how much time the captain might have had to intervene before this became unrecoverable and an altitude or something like that they might have been able to recover?
Right, I'll defer that to Mr. English.
Yes, Vice Chairman Landsberg, while we don't know precisely the point where the airplane could be recoverable, from the beginning of the anomaly where the go-around mode was activated through to the point where the airplane still hadn't deviated from that 6,000 foot altitude very much, the captain had about 20 seconds or so to notice first the inappropriate, the mode change and the level off, which was one opportunity to intervene before the airplane started to become extreme. And then if you remember where the throttles went back and forth, that was about 20 seconds or so into the event. And at that point, the aircraft had not yet started the very steep descent. And there was probably some amount of time after that where still a correct intervention could have changed the situation.
So roughly about 20 seconds, they likely would have been able to recover.
Maybe a little more, but that's a good estimate.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good.
What happened in this accident is not difficult to understand, but why it happened is a lot harder to grasp. The bottom line is that a qualified and trained crew flew a perfectly airworthy airplane into a swampy bay. But the NTSB was blunt about the first officer's lack of skill. Here's the NTSB's human factors expert, Dr. William Bramble.
The first officer's performance and training demonstrated that when given enough practice, he was able to perform highly proceduralized actions, but he became overwhelmed when confronted with novel, complex, or unexpected situations. Atlas instructors attributed his difficulties to external circumstances or low confidence. However, his long history of significant performance difficulties is indicative of low aviation aptitude. To mitigate the risk of hiring pilots with unsuitable characteristics, airlines need a systematic, scientifically based approach to pilot selection that assesses relevant pilot characteristics and collects enhanced pilot performance data to validate selection measures and establish appropriate cutoff scores. Airlines would benefit from a collaborative effort that allows them to pool data and share best practices in this area. Staff has proposed a recommendation that the FAA establish a clearinghouse of pilot selection data to help operators improve and validate pilot selection strategies.
The first officer's lack of aptitude, according to the NTSB, was abundantly clear. He had worked at 6 airlines and had check ride bus, oral, or line check failures at 4 of them. NTSB Chairman Robert Sumwalt asked staff member David Lawrence about this.
Captain Lawrence, I want to ask you a question here. I looked at the some of the comments from Mesa Airlines as well as Atlas as it related to the first officer, and I want to see if you see a trend here. At Mesa, the check airman said that when the first officer was presented with something unexpected in the simulator, the first officer would get extremely flustered and could not respond appropriately to the situation. When he didn't know what to do, he would become extremely anxious and would start pushing a lot of buttons without thinking about what he was pushing, just to be doing something. And at Atlas, when he busted his first check ride there, the examiner told the NTSB that when the first officer realized that he needed to do something, he often did something inappropriate, like push the wrong button. Here's two different airlines talking about the same person, and they're using almost exactly the same verbiage. Would you say that this behavior that was described at each of these airlines was seen in this accident flight?
We saw the same similarities. In fact, it wasn't just Atlas. It was Air Wisconsin. A check airman from Air Wisconsin had the same identical concerns. The check airman that provided his upgrade training at Mesa said the same thing, that Atlas was. So there was a consistency that this pilot tended to do things when in a stressful situation, just do anything, and start pushing buttons. And it was consistent through all these airlines.
So how did it get this far? Hiring processes of all kinds consisted of a series of filters to weed out unsuited candidates. Airline pilots have to actually walk the walk with a pre-hire simulator check, and even after hire, they have a probationary period and careful monitoring through IOE or initial operational experience. As is required by the FAA, Atlas has an in-house quality control system called Proficiency Watch. It's designed to identify problem pilots for remedial training. If this first officer had problems at Atlas, he wasn't placed in the Proficiency Watch program, according to the NTSB, but rather had his operational experience period extended. The larger issue, according to the NTSB, is that Atlas did not know about all of the first officer's problems at the other airlines, for two reasons. One, as is not uncommon, the airline used an outside designated agent for initial hiring review, and that agency wasn't experienced in aviation, but was basically a records retriever and reviewer. And the records available to them under what's called the Pilot Record Improvement Act were limited and allowed the first officer to hide some of his employment history. Under the newly proposed Pilot Records Database program, the FAA is supposed to set up a system whereby the FAA allows airlines to share pilot data. The NTSB somewhat could barely contain his impatience with FAA foot dragging on implementing this.
Thank you for bringing up the points that you just made about the failure of the FAA to move in a timely manner. I intend to offer an amendment when we get to this point to add the FAA as a contributing factor, that the FAA's failure to implement the pilot records database in a sufficient and timely manner. I intend to offer that as an amendment when we get to that point.
The pilot record database has ignited quite a bit of opposition from industry trade groups, mainly related to the way the FAA wants to implement it. And the NTSB did indeed add the FAA's inaction on the PRD as a factor in this accident. But the probable cause here should be obvious. It was the first officer's inadvertent activation of go-around mode, followed by an inappropriate response once he did. Contributing was the captain's failure to monitor the aircraft situation and to properly transfer control authority to resolve it. Before I go, a few words about somatographic illusion. We will likely never know if that actually happened here or if the first officer was just too inept to handle the airplane. I looked at 10 years worth of general aviation accidents, and somatographic illusion is listed as causal or contributory 23 times in accidents, every one of them fatal. Again, these are best guesses since there's no way to know what was going on inside the pilot's head. As instructors, we try to induce spatial disorientation in training. My method is to put the pilot under the hood with eyes closed and looking in his lap. Then either I'll induce rapid maneuvering or have the pilot do it, followed by recovering on instruments. In years of doing this, I have not even once succeeded in creating somatographic illusion or even vertigo. That's not to say I don't think it can happen, but that the way we train it doesn't appear to make it happen. Either way, the cure is a good disciplined instrument scan centered on the attitude indicator. If the nose is down and airspeed is increasing, level the wings first, then pitch the nose up to level flight. If the speed is decreasing, lower the nose first to gain some energy, then level the wings. This is not complicated stuff, but if you never do it, or you don't do it regularly in training, there could be a smoking crater in your future. For AVweb, I'm Paul Bertorelli. Thanks for watching.